Okay, are you done with the friend of a friend example? Remember to post it on Moodle. I want to see you too. So another vocabulary that I think came up in at least one example we looked at is Dublin Core. So I mentioned Dublin Core before. This is a very well-known vocabulary for describing publications, books, and other online resources. So if you have to describe information like who is the author, the publisher, publication date, and similar information, everyone is using Dublin Core. And I think you have seen the prefix DC in a few examples. So DC title, DC creator, and so on. So remember, reuse vocabularies whenever possible. And when you have to describe a resource like publication, you should use the Dublin Core vocabulary. Let's go back to the example that we started with in the beginning, which is an example for a glossary or a thesaurus. And there is a vocabulary called SKOS. So the example you've seen in the beginning was the classification from the Library of Congress, where we want to describe, for example, information about authors, publishers, and their relationships between them. And that's a concrete example for a glossary or a more structured thesaurus. And this is something that predates the knowledge graphs and even IT by many decades, even hundreds of years. So people started classifying and organizing concepts for a long time. So there are all kinds of classification mechanisms in all kinds of domain. There are classifications for literature, for art, for architecture, for technical terms, and they are used all over the place. So it seemed like a very good idea to make use of all of this existing work in classifications, glossaries, thesaurus, and bring them to knowledge graphs to be able to use them on the web and in AI-type applications. And this is done with a vocabulary called SKOS. So this gives you a way to translate an existing classification, glossary, or thesaurus into a knowledge graph form. So this is similar to the one we looked at the beginning. For example, you want to look up the work of fiction, and then you can find a URI in the Library of Congress, and then find definitions for it, alternative terms, as well as broader terms and narrower terms. So you can see this is a thesaurus. It organizes the term in subclasses and superclasses and related classes. And you can already see how you can use this to connect different pieces of knowledge with each other. So if you see something that falls into the alternative labels, you can still connect it automatically to the concept of fiction in this vocabulary from the Library of Congress. And this is again just one vocabulary, one example using the SKOS vocabulary. So in a thesaurus, the structure is rather simple because what you have typically is an entry with a label. It has some alternative labels, and then it has this hierarchy, both more specialized terms, narrower terms, and then what in programming you would be the superclass, the broader terms. So there are, since this is something that has been around for so long, there are various standards like an ISO standard. And this SKOS vocabulary gives you a way to translate this structure into a knowledge graph, into an RDF representation. So for example, going back to the Library of Congress concept for fiction, first you can see that this is of type SKOS concept. So this is how it connects with this SKOS vocabulary. And then we have broader terms. For example, sorry, let's start here on this side. So we have the concept, and this is the concept for fiction. We have the alternative labels. So instead of fiction, it might also be called metafiction or novel. Then we have links to both narrower and broader terms. So a narrower term would be something like a subclass, adventure story, allegory, and a broader term would be something like a superclass, so literature. So this is how it connects this concept with the other entries using the SKOS vocabulary. So SKOS broader, SKOS concept, and so on. And then you can use the resulting knowledge graph to describe information that you have. For example, here we have the book, the Glass Palace, with the URI describing it. So we can use, remember, Dublin core, DC title, to provide the title of the book. But then we can say that the subject is of type historical fiction. So we are using the entry in the Library of Congress to define exactly what it is. And we can from there then use the Library of Congress graph to find out that this is a type of fiction and navigate the extended graph. If you serialize it, it looks like this. We have our book with the title and the subject using Dublin core. And then we say that this here is a SKOS concept. So this is the one from the Library of Congress. It's historical fiction. And we can connect this with our book here. So the subject of the book is this concept from the Library of Congress. And from there, we get all of this additional information. So what SKOS gives you is existing classes and properties for describing concepts, giving them labels, both preferred labels and alternative labels, definitions for those, as well as semantic relations like related entries, broader entries, and narrower entries. So whenever you have some existing classification scheme for pretty much anything that has been out there, like books and artwork and classifications of technological terms and so on, you can easily bring them into a knowledge graph form using this SKOS vocabulary. And people use this for translating existing glossaries and thesauri into knowledge graph form for the last couple of years. So almost everything that you might want in terms of existing work is now available in forms of a knowledge graph for an AI application. So this is a very useful vocabulary for many types of applications. Later we'll see how we can query these information in the graph. And when you interact with a human as times of an AI agent, they are very helpful for describing the data in the graph because they translate very well to information that a human can use. So this was just one more example of a vocabulary. Again, there are a lot more vocabularies, and after working with this for a while, looking at existing knowledge graphs and some other resources, you'll get to know some of the most commonly used ones. For example, very often you have to describe geographical information. So there is a geo vocabulary. You might need citations, bibliographic references, especially in a scientific context. There's a vocabulary called BIBO. You might need copyright licenses for any kind of work, software, but also other projects. So you might know the Creative Commons project that has published a number of licenses, and there's also a formal language you can use in a knowledge graph. Describing places, there's geonames. For e-commerce, for any kind of online shop with products, prices, delivery dates, payment methods, and so on, there is a vocabulary called good relations. There is a vocabulary for web resources and digital objects that's called object reuse and exchange. For online communities, there's SAOC, and there are a lot more. Essentially, what has happened is, I mentioned these standards came out in the late 1990s, and then people started adapting them over more than 10 years. So now we are in the lucky situation that after more than a decade of work, we now have a very comprehensive collection of both vocabularies to describe information online and also the actual databases, the knowledge bases that are described using these vocabularies. Some of those we'll see in the coming week. And for the last part of the lecture, I'll show you one more example vocabulary, the schema.org. See you then.